So now we open up the floor for questions. I think we have about 15 minutes for any questions you might have, and then also our speakers have some questions that are common to them. Go ahead. We do have one microphone. Please step up to the mic.
So, John and Steve, you guys both talked earlier about rod ovens and SMAW electrode storage and exposure times. So let's just take a 718, for example, that has a 4-hour exposure time. It comes out of the rod oven at 250 degrees, for example. It's going to acclimate to the ambient air temperature within 4 hours, something considerably less than 4 hours. So as an auditor, how do you judge how long that rod has been out? Has it been out for 3 hours or 3 days? How can you really tell that?
And they're pretty straightforward and to the point. You know, they'll tell you how long they got it. You know, how long did you get this rod out? You know, where did you get it? When did you get it? And they'll tell you. The other is if it's really cold to touch, and I understand about the ambient temperature, but if it's cold and you can see the color change, the dampness get into the flux of it, you know it's been out for a while.
And to add to that, that's where rod control really comes into play. If you have somebody in authority distributing those rods, whether it be in a rod crib or a supervisor unlocks the oven and gives them enough, judging enough for the particular repair they're going to do, that gives you the warm and fuzzies too. But at the same respect, you trust the welders as much as you can, but if you're walking around a shop and you see low hydrogen electrodes laying under tables and under tank cars and sitting on cabinets, that's a pretty good indication that there's a lack of control over those rods. So that's something I'd take into consideration too.
Okay, I would say, so you know, we've done something like this at our QA conference last January. We're going to do it again this January, and the group there we could have gone for 4 hours on questions.
Yeah.
So here's one.
So you mentioned 87 findings or non-compliances at repair tracks. So we've got the manufacturers, the OEMs, and the heavier repair shops, which are generally M1003 certified. How much, so 87 findings at these repair tracks, how many locations does that constitute?
In the 800 range, 800 to 850. So 1 out of every 10 facilities we're finding this.
It's not too bad.
I know it doesn't sound bad, but we're only there 1 day a year.
Good point.
So it leads to questions to other items. But, you know, it's not bad, but it is coming up. You know, it's something that's an important item. And some of the repairs that you could see are pretty questionable.
Yeah, but I guess I would add on to that, you know, your reports, Steve, that your auditors create, those get forwarded to the mechanical departments. If it's a railroad rip track, they're going to get forwarded to the mechanical department, and then it's from there we can take it and, you know, identify the problem. Is it put in a corrective action? Is it training? Is it process? Is it, you know, the consumables we're using? Whatever it is, that communication is key for us to get it fixed.
So we talked about S402 a little bit with brake pipe and how sometimes when you qualified to plate, you're not necessarily to pipe and vice versa. Why is there an exception for brake pipe, and how do we determine that we could sometimes be qualified by not, if you see what I'm saying?
Sure. You take it?
Started.
Okay.
When that mandate came out, up until that point, because the code allows that if you're qualified on groove welds on plates, it qualifies fillet welds on all thicknesses on plate and pipe. But brake pipe being so critical, I believe, and I'm not, don't mean to be speaking for the AAR here because I wasn't involved in that decision, but I believe the criticality of that particular operation drove that decision. And another thing, and I guess I should have mentioned this too during the presentation, is that also requires that after the welding, those brake pipe are to be blown out and cleaned out. And I highly suspect that at times that isn't happening either. But I think it's the criticality of that particular operation that drove the requirement that if you're going to even make fillet welds on brake pipe, you have to be pipe certified. But that's based on my own thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say you're dead on, John. The D15 committee that I'm part of, that was actually a recommendation from our group to the Brake Systems Committee, who controls S402. You know, just as you said, welding on pipe sometimes qualifies you for plate, but not necessarily vice versa. There is a diameter piece that comes into it, a pipe of greater than 24 inches. It's really the same. But yeah, it does come down to the safety benefit of having special focus on the brake pipe. It's stopping the 100-car train, right? So we need that level of skill set, specific skill set on brake pipe.
Like the pressure vessel.
Right, in addition to if it blown out, right, then it has to pass a leakage test. So there's a lot of sensitivity around the criticality of the brake pipe.
Yeah, this is a two-part question. The first one is, does a maintenance department welding machines have to be calibrated and certified and so forth and follow under all the requirements that you've shown this morning?
When you say maintenance, you mean as far as keeping the building up and blah, blah, blah?
That's correct.
Well, that would fall under AWS D11 as far as structural welding goes, and they do have requirements for making sure the equipment is suitable for the repair too. If you're talking like building a table that you're going to set something on.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you know, none of the codes really address that. I don't think there's, to the best of my knowledge, there's no requirements for that whatsoever, and that was something I had to deal with when I was working with international groups like EN ISO 15614. And there seemed to be an understanding that if somebody's building a table to set stuff on, that falls outside the scope of these particular codes. Probably not a good idea, but there's nothing in the codes that govern building a table in the maintenance shop to put a component on that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Just a follow-up question. What's some of the best practices you've seen where you've seen maintenance welders versus production welders? What's some of the best practices that you've seen where they keep them separate or identified separate?
Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Well, you kind of hit it, Don, when you said that they identify them separately. They'll stencil something on the welding machine to designate it as maintenance, and the other ones they don't designate. But I have seen that they've designated certain welding machines as maintenance only.
And that would fall in line again with calibration. If it is a maintenance machine and they're not following annual calibration, a production welder shouldn't be using it anyway to begin with. So.
Good question.
That was a good question, Don. And let's take it one step further, as long as we're talking about that one too. If we're talking about a maintenance machine, it's not to be used in production. Remember, we were talking about tagging something out of service or quarantining that particular piece of equipment. A maintenance welding machine is going to be used for making tables or something like that. It has no business being on the shop floor anyway. It should be in a maintenance area. It should be quarantined from the equipment that's actually being used for production. That's probably number one as far as best practices go.
Morning. I figure I'm on a panel, so I better ask a question, right? You made some good comments about welder certification,
Yes, sir.
Welders and how they're certified. And then what happens when you're doing an audit and you find that maybe they're not knowledgeable in the particular things that they should be certified on, such as how to measure a weld, what weld symbols are, et cetera, et cetera. So when you find those things, what's the so what? So what do you do next?
Well,
What do you do with the welder? What do you do with the product that they've worked on?
well, the first thing you've identified in a situation like that is insufficient training for the welder. So that's the first thing that would have to be addressed. Now, as far as the corrective action, preventative action, and I'll let you guys jump in here in a second, my understanding, Don, and the AAR is that training is no longer going, in and of itself, is not going to be accepted anymore as a preventative action. There has to be other actions involved. But that's the first thing that would be identified. And then you'd start looking at the training program. But what you do with the welder from that point on, other than training, I think it's kind of at the discretion of the auditor and the company coming up with a corrective action, preventative action that would satisfy the auditor and the AAR. That's about all I can give you, but I'll let somebody else add to that also.
What I would expect to see is, the knee-jerk reaction, which would be, take a look at what the welder has been doing. Can you x-ray the welds that he has? Can you look at the welds that he's been doing? Do you have to recall product based on that? You have to look at what he's done. And is there something out there that's a potential problem? So the first thing is, okay, he doesn't know, let's look at what the product is that he's putting out, is it correct or not? And then I would go into the training. Yeah, training by itself is not an acceptable thing, but training and looking at the program and evaluating the person, all of that is stuff that you could look at in the corrective action.
Yeah, I think it's important to identify if this is an M1003 facility, right? That program, that quality assurance system has got requirements for corrective action, preventive action. So when you're talking about a finding, you need to get down to the cause and effect diagram, get the right people in the room to solve why did this happen. And then obviously you have to contain whatever was released. I think, Steve, you hit on that. But if you do cause and effect and then ask why 5 times for each causal method or subject, then you should be able to, as your M1003 team, you should be able to get down to the root cause of why it happened.
And that is a good question, because I think sometimes training doesn't get the attention it's required, because those training requirements are part of the Code of Federal Regulations. So that's very serious stuff. So when we start seeing insufficient training, like we were saying, you got to look at that program, because that's critical. So that was a really good question and needed to be brought out.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Do you have any points from your questions, anyone here that wants to bring up quickly to get across?
Yeah, I guess we talked a lot about AWS G15 and AWS dockets. There is a new updated D15 publication that should be coming out first quarter of 2019. It's at the Technical Advisory Committee level within the AWS structure. So that's D15.1, applicable to cars and locomotives. There are 2 other AWS publications related to the rail industry. One of them is 15.2. That's currently a recommended practice, but there's been a Herculean effort to get it moved into a specification document, and I would expect that to be re-released sometime next year as well. And then a very new topic for D15 be a whole new D15.3 code book on resistance welding. And it's, I think that's really geared toward like passenger equipment, not necessarily freight.
Okay, thank you again. Thanks to our speakers. So some of our speakers will receive this nice cube for their office. These guys will get these white boxes. I'm not sure what's in them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay, last, I have a few announcements. Thank you. And we'll get started again. We have a 15-minute break, and Randy's going to come up and lead us on Railcar Repair Committee Session 2. One thing, if you are leaving, John Robertson, show our gift to all of our guests today.
We have a flashlight for you. Be sure to stop by and pick one up. Pretty nice little lights.
That's great for weld inspection.
So we have flashlights. And if you want to rate our speakers, if you get the RSI CMA app and go into this session, you can rate the speakers as well. Okay, so for anyone that's not familiar with our March Rail website, we have all of our presentations from previous years on there. So you can go back and look at many hours of presentations from past conferences as well. So it'll be up there. It'll take a little while, but we'll get them up there.